world without it. And you've got sort of Greg's vision of, I would say, the mechanics behind the scenes. That the WTO is not going to change the world tomorrow, but it is vital to keep the wheels spinning. And it'll be interesting to see where Dr. Ngozi falls on that, because I think all three are true to a really strong extent. All three of those components, the rules have to be there, the technical work has to happen, but at the same time, I think without what you were describing, it's hard to see how the political momentum and the political capital investment to keep the organization alive, where that will come from, and where the engagement to make the technical stuff keep working will come from either. If people don't fundamentally believe that this thing is vital and useful and is the answer to big questions.
If I may, I don't know if we're like running out of time or if we're just waiting for the call to get started, but I think the answer lies somewhere between Inu's and Greg's sort of vision. I think the WTO is incredibly important at being technical. In some ways, that's its comparative advantage. No pun intended. I mean, that's where it has distinguished itself. I think that's what members expect of it. The Secretariat is incredibly efficient and competent at the things they've been doing for the past, decades. On the same hand, I think we're struggling with an identity crisis of global reform, the WTO having to be seen to be part of it, and a very progressive woman at the realm who's worked in other facets of international governance. We can't kind of cabin her. Her job is to make the WTO relevant. So how do we kind of walk that line between doing what we're good at and being relevant in a new world where trade is no longer seen as being sort of a siloed technical topic? It's in everything. It's in climate change, it's in women, it's in warfare, it's in food security, it's everywhere. It's in regional integration, which is really relevant in parts of Africa and the Caribbean and Asia Pacific. How do we walk the line of making it a issue for all, inclusive, sustainable, while at the same time making sure we don't spread ourselves too thin in areas where we really haven't really tread before? I think that's the crisis, really, or the challenge, or the opportunity facing the DG, and I'd like to see where she comes down.
I think that's a really salient point. She was brought in, I think, in a lot of ways as this incredible experiment of, can we infuse energy into the WTO through this leader with amazing energy, convening power, and the ability to bring people together. And I have just seen the feed has just gone live. Delegates are taking their seats, so we can, if my technical team waves at me to tell me we are ready, we can try to switch over and tune in and see if we can begin furiously typing our commentary rather than saying it out loud.
Thank you very much for that. Can everybody hear me? If you want to hear me, you have to put on the headphones. Excellencies, friends and colleagues, my name is Bernie Kuyten, and on behalf of WTO Director General Okonjo-Iweala, I offer you a warm welcome to the 2022 WTO Public Forum. We are delighted to see everyone back in person and to see so many of you in this room for the biggest high-level trade forum in the world. The past couple of years have shown that technology can help us engage and connect from all corners of the world, but it does not substitute for a handshake or a cup of coffee. This is why we put so much emphasis on having all speakers and participants present in Geneva. You're here, and I encourage you to take the chance to meet and talk to each other. This event is actually for you. We're doing things a bit different this year. We want to hear from you what trade can do to help and contribute to a sustainable and inclusive recovery from the shocks of the past 2 years, and how to make the system more crisis-proof, hence having more than 140 sessions, over 600 speakers, and close to 3,500 registered participants. We do not want to run short of ideas. Oh, this is interesting, it's coming up. And instead of having the traditional keynote speech, we will open with a candid face-to-face conversation between the WTO Director General and CNN's Richard Quest, a man who does not need any further introduction. They will look at the challenges facing the global economy and how trade can contribute and be part of the solution. We will then take a 15-minute break to allow for stage transition to get it ready for the forum's opening panel with Richard Quest, Mariana Mazzucato, Dr. Sumia Swaminathan, Cameron Soul, and Bogolo Kenewendo. After this panel, the stage setup will be changed again to prepare for a conversation between Dr. Ngozi and Gianni Infantino, President of FIFA, to start at 1:30. So now, without further ado, let me thank you for your attention, and let's get started and kick off with a short introduction video. After that, Richard and the DG will take over. Thank you so much.
Good morning. I feel a bit like walking into the lion's den here. Here is a room of which I have reported about the outcome many years, and now I find myself in it and wondering what everybody does. And that's the goal today, to speak and to try and understand to some extent where we're going, what we are doing, and why we are doing it, particularly as it relates to trade. The Director General is with me, Dr. Ngozi. You decided, oh, and by the way, we will take questions. At various points, we will take questions, and I'm ably informed that everybody in this room knows how this extremely complicated system of microphones on the tables works. So you're ahead of me on the game on that. Director General, you said to me when you asked me to come here today that this was not business as usual. Why not?
Well, it's not business as usual because the world is in a very difficult place at this time. We have a situation in which we are grappling with multiple crises. I often refer to it as a poly-crisis, simultaneous exogenous shocks hitting the world. We have security shocks, we have climate shocks, we have energy shocks, we have food price shocks, and all of this hitting countries at the same time. So we cannot afford to do business as usual. We have to be able to think out of the box, and we have to accomplish things. That's why I said it's not business as usual.
Do you think everybody realizes it's not business as usual?
Well, I think everybody is feeling these shocks, unless they're extremely, extremely rich and insulated. But certainly at the WTO, I would say members know that it's not business as usual.
The theme is recovery. What recovery? I mean, we are going backwards now as a result of the war in Ukraine, higher food prices, global inflation through arguably monetary mismanagement. So what recovery are we talking about? There isn't one.
Well, you know, Richard, I think there was in 2021, we were beginning to see signs of a recovery from the pandemic. Numbers were looking up, trade numbers, global growth numbers. And then, of course, we had the shock of the war in Ukraine, compounded by the climate shocks. So that's why we were thinking of a post-pandemic recovery. But now we have to weather what looks like an oncoming recession. Our trade numbers, we're right in the middle of our new forecast, but the indicators are not looking too good. Global growth forecasts have been downgraded by both the World Bank and the IMF. So, but as we enter the recession, if we're going to enter one,
do you believe there will be we'll pass this down to a recession in the developed or a global recession or both?
I think a global recession.
Right.
That's what I think we're edging into. But at the same time, we have to start thinking of the recovery. We have to restore growth. It's too important, especially for our poorer members at the WTO. We have to think of what we need to do, what policies we need to pursue to restore growth.
Do you agree with the increase in interest rates, the tightening of monetary policy taking place in the major developed economies?
It's very tough for an economist, in a way, to answer this question.
Why am I not surprised?
First of all, with the inflationary pressures we have in the world, I mean, in some emerging markets and developing countries, we're talking double-digit numbers. In some developed countries, it's high single digits. So what do? Central banks don't really have too much of a choice but to tighten and increase interest rates. But the repercussions on emerging markets and developing countries is quite severe. Because they too are tightening and increasing interest rates, but what happens in the developed countries affects their debt burdens, affects what they have to pay to service debt, affects the flight of capital from their economies back into the developed countries. So it's pretty difficult to say. But right now, I think there's not much choice but for central banks to act, because inflation really hits at the poor very badly.
So if we accept that the tightening will continue until inflation is on its way down, What we learned from the pandemic is that in the midst of a crisis, the wealthy countries basically do what they think they need to do, and to hell with anybody else.
Well, let's put it this way. In the midst of the pandemic, in order to save the world from going into a really, really deep depression or recession, the developed countries provided huge amounts of fiscal stimulus and monetary policy easing, which helped to bring the developed world and I would say the world as a whole back from the brink of really going into a deep recession. So I think that was the right response with regard to how to manage the macroeconomy. I think where things didn't go really well is when you look at the pandemic itself and the issue of vaccines and how that was handled, and the inequities of developing countries standing at the back of the queue for quite a long time. Many developed countries contributed money to help purchase the vaccines, but it took some time for that to happen, and by the time the money was there were export restrictions on inputs, export restrictions on finished vaccines, and so there were delays in getting these vaccines to the developing countries where they were needed. So that was not global solidarity at its best. Let's put it that way.
The problem with that is it was exactly what people like you warned about and urged the wealthy economies not to do. Everybody, and I covered this from the get-go, everybody said we must make sure, or policymakers, we must make sure the emerging markets or the developing world is covered, because that famous line from the WHO, until everyone is covered, nobody is covered. But it failed spectacularly.
Well, it failed almost up until the end, when developed countries began to really support and swap contracts and send vaccines to developing countries. But I think by then, expectations, I think many people in developing countries had tuned off. Vaccine hesitancy had set in some. Admittedly, some did not have the infrastructure to handle the vaccine programs well, but I think it was a little late, and we have to not repeat that experience.
Excellent. Just where I wanted you to go.
Uh-oh, I've fallen into a trap already.
Completely. Close the door. It's not where we want to go, says the Director General. And it is exactly where we are going as we look at this recession. You look at the tightening of monetary policy, you look at the flight to capital, you look at the interest rates to GDP and the debt and the repayment services, and the World Bank is forecasting a crisis in emerging markets.
Well, that is true. I mean,
But doesn't that depress you?
Of course it does, Richard. And that's why we have to look at what positively can we do on our own side to see that things get better. So if you look at the WTO, members agreed on many things that would be helpful at the ministerial that we just had in June. Number one, on food prices. I'm happy to say that members agreed to keep export restrictions as low as possibly could be. There's a declaration so that there can be a free flow of food, fertilizers, agricultural goods. Okay, we're not perfect. We still have some of these restrictions on, but the trend is in the right direction. Of the 57 measures that started at the beginning of the war on food and fertilizer, 15 have been phased out. So I hope we'll keep going and more countries will not put restrictions. That's very helpful to the world. There was also an agreement to allow the World Food Programme to purchase food for humanitarian purposes without any restrictions. That is very helpful in terms of looking at the food insecurity issues that we're dealing with. We had other agreements. We had an agreement on the TRIPS waiver on intellectual property. which will allow developing countries to use legal instruments to waive patent rights so that they can manufacture some of the vaccines themselves. So starting to support manufacturing capacity in developing countries is something very important and helpful. Fisheries. For the first time, members agreed something on sustainability to do away with harmful fisheries subsidies, $22 billion in total, that contribute to illegal and unreported fishing, which is leading to overfishing of our oceans. So this is very, very important.
What made the difference? Was it your charming negotiating style?
Oh, I don't think any member would remotely say I'm charming. Quite the opposite. But I think what made the difference is I have to give credit to the members and to the wonderful staff of the Secretariat who supported the work. They decided, and we did something pretty amazing. All members came together, developed and developing countries, everyone round the table.
You see, when you were appointed, one of the criticisms was, well, she's not a trade expert. I mean, slightly untrue, since you've been around trade most of your professional life. But, you know, you're not a technocrat from a trade thing.
I'm not a trade negotiator, put it that way.
Yeah, but maybe that was exactly what was needed, a non-trade negotiator to stand in this room and say, oh, just bloody well do it.
That's exactly what I did. I mean, saying I don't know about trade is nonsense, because by training, of course, when you have a PhD in economics and you don't know trade, I think that is it. In development economics. So that was just something put up. You know, when you're competing, people put up things. But I'm not a trade negotiator, and I didn't believe that was what was needed.
But that's not what was needed at
Exactly.
the WTO.
Exactly.
The WTO needed a canny political operator that could move around the trade agenda.
Oh, well, I've never heard myself described as a canny political operator. But whatever it is, it needed someone to help catalyze. But at the end of the day, the members did the homework. And as I said, credit to the members and the ministers for agreeing to negotiate.
How difficult is it to keep, I mean, I see the ambition into action. How difficult is it to keep that moving forward when there is such difficulty?
Well, you know, negotiations are give and take. It is not easy, but this is a negotiating forum. And I think once a level of trust has been built up, I think having these successes at MC12 augurs well. Doesn't mean it's going to be easy, but we have quite an agenda before the WTO members. I think that helps to build the kind of confidence that may lead us to tackle the next set of problems that will help contribute to these issues that the world is facing.
Do you think we will ever, maybe we should never, I don't know, I'll be interested in your thoughts, have another major round? Uruguay, Doha, yeah, look at that, look. I mean, those of us who covered them have still got the scars. Would you ever, in your right mind, consider launching a major round?
Well, let me put it this way. We still have scars and leftover issues from previous rounds that we have to deal with. I think we should focus on what successes we can get that are very relevant to the issues, the global issues that the world is suffering from now, rather than looking to grand rounds at the moment. There are just so many issues, and
What's your number one issue?
in the short term, it is how to assure food security. I'm really worried about issues of food insecurity for the world, particularly when you think of poor people in rich countries and poor people in poor countries, or poor countries in general. The specter of not having enough food is one that worries me. So to me, that's a top issue. Access to energy. So these are issues that are creating problems at the moment. And you have to ask yourself, where can one be relevant? And I've just said ways and means in which members of the WTO have decided to try to be part of the solution to the problem.
But it's all so incremental.
Well, when you don't have a grand plan, I mean, I think if the war could stop, that would really be helpful. That would be a very big contribution to where we are now, a big answer to our problems. It won't solve everything, but it would certainly contribute. Absent that, we've got to look at what solutions each party can bring to the table, each organization. And certainly, WTO has been able to contribute and will continue to do so.
We'll take some questions from our guests here. Who's got a question for the Director General?
I thought for you, Richard.
I'll take a question and then pass it on to you. It won't be long before somebody blames the media for something. That usually happens. We've been going 20... And we've got a question. Yes, with the mask.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ngozi. At MC12, there was...
Hang on. Are you pushed?
Yes, you need to use the headphones.
Yes.
Oh.
Yes, thank you.
You see, I told you I was a novice. Choose the headphones. Who knew?
Thank you very much, Dr. Ngozi. At MC12, it was quite rushed, and at the end, a lot of decisions were gavelled through before members were able to see the text, for example, on fisheries subsidies or the final text on the COVID TRIPS waiver. How can you assure us that this will not happen in future WTO ministerial conferences so that members can actually
hang on a
chance to read and check
second. Hang on a
these
second.
texts?
How many people have you got looking at these things?
There were hundreds and there were thousands of negotiators here in the dawn of the last day of the ministerial.
What took you so long?
No, they didn't get the text. The text was not available before it was gavelled through in the closing ceremony.
Sounds like a very good
Can I answer
For
that,
some of
Richard? I'm sorry to say that I disagree with you completely. We were in room D, and the question was posed. Would you like to have a couple of hours to look over this text? Or what do you want to do? We gave members the choice, and the answer was no. We want to go to the closing. So I totally disagree with that. Members were asked, and it's documented, that would they like another hour to look at the text? And they said they didn't need another hour. I can see people nodding. So where that conclusion came from, I have no idea.
Why do I feel I've walked into a family argument at Christmas? Who burnt the sprouts? Next question. Yes, please. Push your button. Who are you, by the way?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Princess Puskas, an economist from the... Are you okay? Yes, my name is Princess Puskas, an economist at the Central Bank of Botswana. But you rightfully said, inflation in emerging countries, it's either high single numbers, digit numbers, and we see central banks continue to increase interest rates. And you had mentioned that probably going to increase them until a point where inflation starts falling. And my concern is, inflation is either demand-driven or supply-driven, right? And mostly it's right now, it's supply-driven. And then the thing is, the central bank does not have control over that. And my concern also is there's stagflation, high prices.
But Princess,
yes.
If that's the only tool you've got, and it's your primary responsibility of monetary policy...
Which is very true.
Monetary policy is price stability.
Yes.
You don't have a choice.
You do not have a choice.
Right, thank you.
I agree with you, sir, that price stability is mainly the primary objective. But I'm also saying that maybe, how about like governments maybe trying to get to a point where the fiscal policy and the monetary policy work together?
Oh, I'm glad you asked that. Fiscal and monetary policy working together.
Yes.
What do you make of Liz Truss and the latest budget in the UK?
I hope the UK ambassador is in the audience.
Is the UK ambassador in the audience?
He can answer that question better than me.
I think he's either hiding under the desk.
But let me speak to, you do have a sound point in what you say about whether inflation is demand or supply driven. At this point in time, one will have to sort out, and there's an element of supply driven. And the issue is if it's something that the central banks don't have control over, structural problems in the supply chains, for instance, that they cannot overcome, then you ask yourself the question, is raising interest rates still the right move? So that will happen for now, but central bankers are asking themselves that question. To what extent is it supply-driven? There's no doubt that there's a very large demand-driven element in inflation we had because of the large amounts of fiscal stimulus that was pumped into the developed country economies. But we're getting to that point where those questions are being asked. And if we have that information, then central banks will be asking themselves, will increasing interest rates be the right tool to use for that?
But they'll still have to do it.
They'll
Because
have to
in
do
the
it up to a
absence-
point. But up to a point, if it's supply-driven factors you don't have control
Right.
over, then continuing to increase interest rates is counterproductive.
By the way, if you ever want to know why Dr. Ngozi got the job, with her political canniness, as I put it, the way she avoided my question on the UK budget is a brilliant example. Do we have another question? Yes, two more. How are we doing on time? 10 more minutes. Another question. Yes, sir. You at the front. Who are you and what's your question?
Greetings. My name is Hannes Schlimmern. I'm with WTO Advisors. I'm a trade policy advisor and
For who?
trade lawyer. For everybody who pays me,
No, for the WT.
WTI Advisors.
Oh, WTI. Right.
Dr. Ngozi, I'm torn between a number of questions I have for you. But the one that really bothers me or really brings me up is in June you pulled off almost a miracle, you being everybody who did it, which is multilateralism all of a sudden still was there when people had declared it to be dead. Now, one of the features of multilateralism, or perhaps the central feature here, is the MFN principle. The MFN principle seems to be at odds with initiatives like friendshoring, for example. At the same time, today, it's very difficult to tell people not to look for their friends when their not-so-friends are busy doing all kinds of things. How do we rescue both?
Good question.
Well, MFN is most favored nation principle for people. I think that, first of all, we've got to admit that the crises we've seen, the exogenous shocks, have shown us that perhaps we have a concentration of supply chains and manufacturing capacity for certain sectors or products in certain parts of the world or countries that may not build resilience for the world. So something has to be done to diversify that capacity and build more resilience. Now, is the answer friendshoring? Is it just at home instead of just in time? Is it friendshoring? Is it reshoring? Reshoring is just at home. Friendshoring can be just in case. You have to ask yourself that question. I think the answer should be, let us use this opportunity to diversify globally our supply chains. Let's use it as an instrument to bring those who did not benefit from globalization into global value chains. There are many developing countries with the right environment for manufacturing where we could diversify to. So I'm saying that friendshoring is not the only answer. We can do reglobalization by using it to bring others in. And we can still solve the same problem that we are trying to solve of diversifying supply chains.
Just about out of time. I've got a question or two for you. You have grandchildren?
Yes? You never know where you're going with Richard. What is it?
I'm just wondering, maybe because I'm 60 this year and just sort of thinking...
You're a spring chicken.
Flattery won't get you easier questions. What keeps you going? I mean, why do it? Why put yourself through the grinding negotiations in this room, day in, day out? What makes you get...
Well, I love my job. And I think it's a privilege to be able to do it. I think that any time you have a chance to give back, which is what I was brought up to do, that education is not just for yourself. That's what my parents taught me, but to use to benefit others. So if you have the privilege of actually being able to use your training and to be able to give back and have a job that you can do that helps you do that, why not? So I tend to spring up in the morning ready to go. And sometimes I'm surprised at myself because it's not an easy job. Is that good enough?
Well,
That's the truth. I don't know what else to tell you.
you've just put the vision of you springing up in the morning ready to go to battle, which will be with me for the rest of the day. Ladies and gentlemen, the Director General. Now, I am told that we will take a short 15-minute break for people to go and discover where the coffee is located. Fair trade coffee, I hope.
Ce royaume a toujours été protégé par les Agoji.
Agoji!
Que vois-tu?
Ils sont beaucoup plus nombreux que nous.
Everyone has been talking about the situation in Iran. And if you haven't heard, about 10 days ago, a young woman named Mahsa Amini was arrested by the morality police for not properly covering her hair, and then she died in their custody. Ever since then, Iranians have been pouring into the streets demanding justice for her death and freedom for Iran's women. Now, so far, the government has answered the protesters with brutal violence and has shown no signs of reconsidering the law that requires women to cover their hair. In fact, last week, the president of Iran was scheduled to be interviewed by CNN's Christiane Amanpour